Welcome to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast, where each week we bring you selected content from the magazine for your encouragement and edification. We continue this week pursuing our mini-series on Puritans, both well-known and somewhat or even largely neglected. From two fairly neglected Puritans from the north of England, Thomas Jolly of Wymond Houses and Oliver Hayward of Northaram, this week we travel to England's far southwest and the picturesque, red-soiled county of Devon. Devon, incidentally, is the only English county to have two separate coasts, one on the English Channel and one on the Bristol Channel. Any listeners wondering how this can be can consult the map to which we've linked in the show notes to quickly clarify the situation. This week's Puritan is associated chiefly with the town of Dartmouth on the south coast, which lies 40 miles or so south of Exeter, Devon's county town. This Puritan ministered to seafaring men, among others, and at times tailored his teaching to their particular situation, their temptations, and their trials. By this point, a number of you will have guessed correctly that our subject this week is the well-known Puritan whose surname is spelt Flavel. And while there is general agreement on the best spelling of his surname, there has been some confusion concerning the pronunciation of it. Jeremy Walker, pastor at Maidenbower Baptist Church in Crawley, in introducing an address on this Puritan at the 2023 Banner Ministers Conference, puts us in the picture.
The neatest thing would have been if I could have called this address Travel with Flavel. But it does raise the question of whether or not we're going to travel with Flavel or travel with Flavel.
Flavel, or Flavel? Which is it? And does consulting with other ministers improve the situation at all? Maybe and maybe not. Here is Mark Dever's pronunciation.
This is actually the first one I think I ever read, John Flavel's The Mystery of Providence.
Turning to another Baptist pastor, Comrade Mbewe of Kabwata Baptist Church in Zambia, we find some support for Mark Dever's position.
John Flavel's The Mystery of Providence.
However, the Flavel approach isn't universal. Here's Alistair Begg talking about the same book.
Turning to Flavel's stuff on the doctrine and the mystery of providence.
So we have Flavel for Mark Dever and Comrade Mbewe, and Flavel for Alistair Begg. But are those the only options? No, indeed. Let's listen to Dr. Sinclair B. Ferguson, speaking in November of 2016, who lends credence to a different approach.
John Flavel, I think, along with Thomas Watson.
However, a video released the following year saw Dr. Ferguson use a different pronunciation.
If you're going to start reading Puritans, I think the book I actually suggest is John Flavel's The Mystery of Providence.
So, what are we to make of all this? Well, when confusion reigns, we need some authoritative guidance. And in this case, we could do much worse than attend to the Banner of Truth General Manager John Rawlinson's case for what might be termed the Middle English pronunciation of this Puritan's name. This is from his biographical address at the 2022 Banner Youth Conference.
I call him John Flavel. The reasoning for that is this. The time of history that John Flavel lived in, England had been at war on and off for about 100 years with the French. And much of that war was conducted at sea. It was a naval warfare. And John Flavel ministered for the majority of his life in Dartmouth on the south coast of England, in the West Country. The West Country produced, shall we say, the backbone of the English Navy, either by volunteers or by press ganging. And I think it's highly unlikely that anybody in their right minds would wish for their name to be pronounced in any kind of Frenchified manner whatsoever. And it seems to me that the best Middle England, safe England pronunciation of the letters Flavel, sometimes with an extra L, is Flavel. as in naval.
So there we have it. The argument from historical context seems solid, and so, leaving Flavel and Flavel behind, we'll opt for Flavel for our purposes in this episode. Our first piece this week appeared in number 60 of the magazine, September 1968. Simply entitled John Flavel, it is presumed to have been written by Iain H. Murray. An old writer on the Puritans tells us how Robert Atkins, in one of his last sermons at St. John's, Exeter, before the Great Ejection of 1662, took the opportunity of declaring, in the presence of Bishop Gowden and other dignitaries, that those ministers who beget converts to Christ may most properly be called fathers in God. Judged by this Pauline standard, Atkins's Devonshire colleague, John Flavel, belonged to the front rank of fathers. So, at any rate, thought his first biographer, who says, God crowned his labours with many conversions. And so also thought his congregation, who, following his death, placed a monumental inscription in his old church, bearing a testimony which in 1709 brought about its removal. At that date, the vicar, far removed from the hissing hot evangelist who had once occupied the same incumbency, successfully complained to local magistrates about the inscription on the grounds that it was worthy of a bishop. The eldest son of the Reverend Richard Flavel, John Flavel was born at Bromsgrove, Worcestershire, about 1628, and thus spent his childhood in the stormy years which led up to the Civil War in 1642. Following the defeat of the Royalist cause, he plied his studies hard as a commoner at University College, Oxford, and then, in 1650, entered the ministry to share in that sunny decade of spiritual reaping which preceded the restoration of Charles II. Speaking of the privilege of being born in the 17th century, and contrasting the then conditions with the many hundred years of paganism in England, and also with those later miserable days in which Queen Mary sent so many hundreds to heaven in a fiery chariot, Flavel once urged his hearers to observe the special care of providence. That our turn to be brought upon the stage of this world was graciously reserved for better days. We are not only furnished with the best room in this great house, but before we were put into it, it was swept with the besom of national reformation from idolatry. Yea, and washed by the blood of martyrs from popish filthiness, and adorned with gospel lights, shining in as great lustre in our days as ever they did since the apostles' days. If Plato could bless God that he was born in Greece and brought up in the time of Socrates, much more cause have you to admire providence that you were born in England and brought up in gospel days here. Flavel's life work was carried on in the county of Devon, first in the country parish of Diptford, and from 1656 in the thriving seaport of Dartmouth. Protestantism had early been established in Devon. Half a century earlier, the Puritan preacher John Barlow of Plymouth had bidden the people to remember that as that matchless peer, Sir Francis Drake, had spared nothing to establish a water supply for the town, so they also had a higher duty. Shall we never be at any charge to cause the water of life to flow through the towns and places about us by the conduits of faithful preachers? Certainly, the gospel spread mightily amongst the seafaring homes of the southwest. And to the inhabitants of Dartmouth, Flavel could write in 1671, "You are a people that were born under and bred up with the gospel. It hath been your singular privilege, above many towns and parishes in England, to enjoy more than 60 years together an able and fruitful ministry among you. And it must be owned to your praise that you have testified more respect to the gospel than many other places have done." Through the last years of the Protectorate, and until that August day in 1662, when about 120 ministers in Devon, and approaching 1,800 in England as a whole, were turned out of their livings for failing to comply with the terms of the Act of Uniformity, Flavel preached every week at Townstall, the mother church which stood on the hill outside the town, and fortnightly at the Wednesday lecture in Dartmouth. Thereafter, he took his place in the suffering ranks of the nonconformists, and had a full share of the persecution which, with greater or less intensity and short intermissions, was to continue until James II fled the country in 1688. The repressive legislation which followed 1662, while it broke the evangelical ministry of England in a public sense, scattered gospel light into new areas, and led, not infrequently, to the use of strange pulpits. We hear of Flavel preaching at midnight in the great hall of a house at South Molton. On another occasion, in a wood 3 miles from Exeter, and, the most colourful sight of all, though it could not have been a comfortable one, at Saltstone Rock, an island in the Salcombe estuary, which is submerged at high tide. Safe there from the hand of their persecutors, writes Leon Turner, they would linger in devout assembly till the rising tide drove them to their boats. But wherever Flavel was forced to wander, he was never far from Dartmouth. What Ephesus was to Paul, Kidderminster to Richard Baxter, and at a later date, Dundee to Robert Murray McShane, the Devon seaport was to Flavel. Oh, that there were not a prayerless family in this town, was one of many petitions offered for Dartmouth. Taking advantage of the indulgence given by Charles II in 1672, for which he and 163 of his congregation wrote an address of thanks to the king, Flavel obtained license for a nonconformist meeting house in the town, and, when this was withdrawn, he stayed at his post until the summer of 1682, when his person was in such danger that he took ship to London on July 10th. From the capital, he wrote on August 15, "I am hurried hither out of Devonshire by the fury of the storm that lies hard upon me. My estate is pursued as a prey by an outlawry, my liberty by a capias." In London, Flavel joined the congregation of his friend William Jenkin, and narrowly escaped arrest when the latter was seized in September 1684. Declining an invitation to succeed Jenkin, Flavel again returned to Dartmouth, where that same year he was burned in effigy by a mob, and, despite all hazards, maintained a ministry among his scattered flock until that November day in 1688, when the bells of Exeter, Plymouth, and no doubt of Dartmouth also, rang to welcome the coming of William of Orange, an event which led quickly to the flight of James II. By the time of this glorious revolution, Flavel's work was approaching its end. Speaking for his fellow ministers, he wrote, "We have long borne the burden and heat of the day. We are veteran soldiers, almost worn out." While visiting Exeter in order to preach, he died suddenly on June 26, 1691, in his 64th year. We turn now from Flavel's life to his usefulness as an author. In his own lifetime, the influence of his books was considerable, as the story of a Christian bookseller in London during that period can illustrate. A sparkish gentleman entering his shop in search of some playbooks was advised to purchase Flavel's treatise, Keeping the Heart. Picking up the book and glancing at its pages, the customer exclaimed, "What damnable fanatic was he who made this book?" However, after further conversation, the work was taken with a promise from the shopkeeper that the money would be returned if he still disliked it after a first reading. About a month later, the same man, changed in appearance, re-entered the shop, and addressing the bookseller said, Sir, I most heartily thank you for putting this book into my hands. I bless God that moved you to do it. It hath saved my soul. Blessed be God that ever I came into your shop. He then proceeded to buy a further 100 copies of the book. Of the importance of Flavel's writings in the 18th century, abundant evidence exists. The leaders of the Evangelical awakening, which at last broke the spiritual torpor of that century, drew much from his works. Jonathan Edwards frequently made use of him, and George Whitefield ranked Flavel with John Bunyan and Matthew Henry. See Whitefield's Journals, page 583. But his usefulness was preeminently seen among the common people. Dr. Rice, in giving a description of the congregation of Samuel Davies, who ministered in Virginia in the mid-18th century and is best remembered today for his hymn, Great God of Wonders, All Thy Ways, writes, households generally were furnished with a few standard works of good old times, and were expected to study them carefully. The writer has scarcely ever visited a family, the heads or fathers of which belonged to Mr. Davies' congregation, in which he did not find books or remnant of books, such as Watson's Body of Divinity, Boston's Fourfold State, Luther on the Galatians, Flavel's Works, Baxter's Call to the Unconverted, the Saints' Everlasting Rest, Allen's Alarm to the Unconverted, and others of similar character. 40 years later, Flavel was still being read in Virginia. In a snatch of autobiography, Archibald Alexander, who was born at Irish Creek, Virginia in 1772, comments on how Flavel's writings were used in his spiritual awakening, and continues, the year 1788 to 89 was in many respects the most important of my life. I began to love the truth and to seek after it. To John Flavel, I certainly owe more than to any uninspired author. In 1812, Alexander became the first professor at Princeton Seminary, and before his death in 1851, he had instructed some 1,837 future ministers and missionaries in the truths which he had first learned to love from the works of the old Devon Puritan. It seems that almost any listing of the evangelical authors most popular in the 18th and 19th centuries is sure to contain Flavel's name. One interesting occurrence is in the writings of Rowland Hill, educated at Eton, refused ordination by 6 different bishops, and for many years an evangelist in the Whitefield tradition. In his immensely popular Village Dialogues, designed to impart evangelical ideas through the speeches of representative characters, somewhat after the style of Bunyan, 2 men are introduced discussing the spiritual help they had received through a nonconformist minister's widow who had recently died. Mr. Worthy, I have no doubt but your acquaintance with the good old lady was very profitable. Mr. Lovegood, yes, sir, and still more so, as I got acquainted with her library. For though she had sold some of her husband's books, yet others of them she had preserved. Among these I found many of the writings of Owen, Flavel, President Edwards, Gurnall's Christian in Complete Armour, Archbishop Usher on Justification, Bishop Hall's Works, and others. These she used to call her Sunday company, and to these I had at all times free access. And about 3 years afterwards, when she found herself in dying circumstances, she gave me several of them as keepsakes. No doubt Hill's sketch corresponds to what was a common enough occurrence at the time he wrote, and it gives an interesting confirmation of the place given to Flavel. Testimonies such as the above are not confined to nonconformist writers. Edward Bickersteth, for instance, an eminent secretary of the Church Missionary Society and friend of Charles Simeon, in the early 19th century lists Flavel as an author necessary to a parochial religious library. And for the Minister's Library, under Collective Works of Protestant Divines, he says of the same author, "There are few writers of a more unexceptionable, experimental, affectionate, practical, popular, and edifying character than Flavel." General popularity is by no means always a sure test of the importance of an author. But when that popularity continues over a long period of time, and when a reputation is gained in ages when solid, experimental Christian literature was more esteemed than in our own, there is reason to take note. Certainly, if the sustained regard of Christian readers is any guide, Flavel belongs to the very front rank of evangelical authors. According to the Dictionary of National Biography, collected editions of his works were issued in 1673, 1701, 1716, 1754, 1770, and 1797. A list which could be extended into the last century, and which, of course, passes over the many reprints on both sides of the Atlantic of some of his most popular individual works. It is not difficult to set down some reasons why Flavel's works have attained this widespread usefulness and popularity. 1. Flavel is thoroughly and consistently evangelical. He is always at work turning our attention to Jesus Christ and setting out those great truths of which every generation has equal need. His attainment in this respect is the more impressive when one recalls the long drawn-out sufferings of the period in which he wrote. His father, Richard Flavel, William Jenkin, and other friends all died in prison. But such experiences never embittered him or led him to thrust the controverted church issues to the fore. And a footnote here says, hardly a trace of Flavel's suffering is to be found in his writings. Just occasionally, a sentence like the following from his epistle to the reader in his Husbandry Spiritualized gives us a glimpse of the conditions in which he often worked. "Thou hast here the fruit of some of my spare hours, which were thus employed, when by a sad providence I was thrust from the society of many dear friends into a solitary country dwelling. I hope none will envy me these innocent delights, which I made out of my lonely walks, whereby the Lord sweetened my solitudes there." And as we read, such experiences never embittered Flavel, or led him to thrust the controverted church issues to the fore. He had greater work on hand. It was characteristic of the man that on the day he was discovered and nearly captured by the authorities preaching in a wood near Exeter, his subject was, "Sirs, what must I do to be saved?" The reader of his works will soon find how he delights to handle texts which are full of the gospel. For instance, John 3:16, the admirable love of God in giving his own Son for us. Volume 1, page 62 of his works. Ephesians 3:19, to know the love of Christ. And Revelation 3:20, sermons upon which run to 250 pages in Volume 4 of his works. For this concentration upon the centralities of the faith, Flavel believed there was sound justification. And here Flavel is quoted from Volume 5 of his works, page 527. Take an unregenerate, carnal man, let his life be reformed, and his tongue refined, and call him a zealous conformist, or a strict nonconformist. Call him a Presbyterian, an independent, or what you will. He is all the while but a carnal conformist, or nonconformist, an unregenerate Presbyterian, a carnal independent. For the nature is still the same, though the stamp and figure his profession gives him be not the same. Oh, my friends, believe it, fine names and brave words are of little value with God. To deceive ourselves in truths of the superstructure is bad, and they that do shall suffer loss. 1 Corinthians 3:15. But to deceive ourselves in the foundation is a desperate deceit. and shipwrecks all our hopes and happiness at once. 2. Flavel excels in conveying instruction. Belonging as he did to an age which believed that the gospel minister must be a teacher as well as an evangelist, he constantly aims at imparting knowledge. The principles upon which he acted as an instructor are set out in his excellent treatise, The Causes and Cure of Mental Errors. In this work, he presents the most convincing demonstration of priority which must be given to the understanding, if men are to be saved from the ruin of sin. This being so, the possession of spiritual knowledge is a paramount need. For the understanding being the leading faculty, as that guides, the other powers and affections of the soul follow, as horses in a team follow the forehorse. Knowledge was originally part of the image of God in man, but now in spiritual things, man's life is but one continual error. Of the danger resulting from this condition, we have little awareness. Spiritual dangers affect us less than corporal, and intellectual evils less than moral. Men think there is less sin and danger in the one than in the other, not considering that an apoplexy seizing the head is every way as mortal as a sword piercing the body. The apostle, in 2 Peter 2:1, calls them damnable heresies, or heresies of destruction. An error in the mind may be as damning and destructive to the soul as an error of immorality or profaneness in the life. This is not a matter of mere Christian liberty, but commanded duty, and at our peril be it if we neglect it. The preacher's great work is to aid his hearers towards this end by constantly expounding the Scriptures, and that in a manner calculated to make men understand and value them. The standard Flavel set for others, he constantly sought to follow himself. Truth lies deep, he wrote, as the rich veins of gold do, Proverbs 2. If we will get the treasure, we must not only beg, as he directs, verse 3, but dig also, verse 4. Else, as he speaks, Proverbs 14:23, the talk of the lips tends only to poverty. We are not to take up with that which lies uppermost and next at hand upon the surface of the text, but to search with the most considerative mind into all parts of the written word, examining every text which hath any respect to the truth we are searching for, heedfully to observe the scope, antecedents, and consequence, and to value every apex, tittle, and iota. For each of these is of divine authority. Matthew 5:18. And sometimes greater weight is laid upon a small word, yea, upon the addition or change of a letter in a word, as appears in the names Abram and Sarai. Certainly the 6 volumes of expository material which Flavel has left us show him to be one of the most instructive and informative of the Puritan writers. And it is one of his foremost merits as a teacher that he knew how to convey knowledge in a form which is at once lucid, interesting, and easy to retain. He has plain words suited to the capacity of all his Devon hearers. As he writes, prudence will choose words that are solid rather than florid, as a merchant will choose a ship by a sound bottom and capacious hold rather than a gilded head and stern. Words are but servants to matter. An iron key fitted to the wards of the lock is more useful than a golden one that will not open the door to the treasure. In Flavel, there is a vast fund of illustrations drawn from nature and church history to hold our attention. Yet he does not overload his material with anecdotes. Rather, he uses them with a skill not found in some of the more racy writers of the 17th century. He also has a rich store of pithy quotations to draw upon, and these not infrequently add their own force and interest. Working as he did towards the end of the Puritan period, he had a great wealth of existing literature to draw upon, and in Flavel one repeatedly meets the best writers who had gone before him. The Scottish divines he knows from John Knox through to Samuel Rutherford, and the English from John Bradford and John Fox on through William Perkins to the divines whom he describes as lately sitting at Westminster, now in glory. If anyone wants to find out the best authors of practical divinity in the century which followed the Reformation, John Flavel's quotations will provide a fine guide. 3. Flavel's writings reveal him as a deeply experienced Christian, and therefore as one well fitted to lead us in such experimental subjects as communion with God, prayer, and the life of faith. In the best sense of the word, he is a devotional and practical writer. If he speaks to our minds, it is in order to move our affections and stir us to attain a higher degree of Christian experience. Rarely does he handle a subject without making it speak to us, and the extent to which he succeeds is related to the way in which the weight of his own feelings comes through to us. What we hear him saying to younger brethren in the ministry tells us much about himself. Keep yourselves close night and day at your studies and most fervent prayers. He will make the best divine that studies on his knees. It is one thing to be learned in the truths of Christ, another to be taught by him, as the truth is in Jesus. As ever we expect the truths we preach should operate upon the hearts of others, we first labor to work them in upon our own hearts. Such a preacher was St. Paul. He preached with tears accompanying his words. Philippians 3:18. A hot iron, though blunt, will pierce sooner than a cold one, though sharp. If we knew more of Flavel's personal life as a Christian, it would doubtless teach us more about his success as a preacher. Like most Puritans, he kept a diary, but this was never meant for publication, and Flavel's is probably long since destroyed, excepting the fragment given in the biographical introduction in Volume 1 of his works. But there is one episode which Flavel himself records in his Treatise of the Soul of Man, Volume 3 of his works, and page 57. And if, as seems to be the case, the person who figures in the episode was himself, disguised by the use of the third person, it tells us something about the depth of his personal experience. The story occurs in a section in which Flavel is speaking of the foretastes of heaven and the glory to come with which many believers are favored in this world, the believer being sick of love. That is, he says, she was ready to faint under the unsupportable weight of Christ's manifested and sealed love, not able to bear what she felt. He then illustrates the truth by reference to the experience of two believers, one a martyr, reported by John Fox, the other a man who cried out under the overwhelming sense of the love of Christ, shed abroad into his heart in prayer. "Hold, Lord, hold. Thy poor creature is a clay vessel and can hold no more." Those instances are followed by a much longer narrative relating the experience of a minister, perhaps himself, who during a lonely journey on horseback was so overcome by joy unspeakable and unsupportable that for many hours together he lost all sense of earth and time. Stopping by a spring, he sat down and washed, earnestly desiring, if it were the pleasure of God, that it might be his parting place from this world. He said, death had the most amiable face in his eye that ever he beheld, except the face of Jesus Christ, which made it so. Jonathan Edwards quotes this narrative in an abridged form in his Thoughts Concerning the Present Revival of Religion in New England, 1742, as one proof that a glorious sense of communion with God is not so new as the critics of the 18th century revival imagined. But the whole passage is so beautiful in Flavel's original words that we have not attempted to reproduce it here, not even in abridgment. Now that Flavel is reprinted, all can read it for themselves in his works, Volume 3, pages 57 to 58. In the light of Flavel's personal knowledge of his Redeemer, it is not surprising to note the way he captured the affections of his hearers. We can understand why, when the persecuting 5 Mile Act first drove him out of Dartmouth, he and his congregation at Townstall Churchyard took such a mournful farewell of one another as the place might very well have been called Bockham. And even today it must be a very hard-hearted person who can read Flavel dispassionately. Rather, as we read him, we should be brought into sympathy with one of his hearers of long ago, who, after being seized and fined severely for attending one of Flavel's illegal conventicles, declared, "I take joyfully the spoiling of my goods for the sake of my dear Lord Jesus, who loved me and died for me. He is not only worthy to receive my £40, but life and all I have are too little for him." No doubt this poor tanner and scores of other Christians who belonged to his flock would have endorsed the encomium upon Flavel pronounced by the 18th century evangelical James Hervey, had they lived to hear it. He was, says Hervey, fervent and affectionate, with a masterly hand at probing the conscience and stirring the passions. In closing, there is one more testimony to Flavel's usefulness which cannot be omitted. On February 25th, 1838, Robert Murray McShane preached from 1 Samuel 3:19, a sermon entitled, "God let none of his words fall to the ground." In the course of his exposition, he gave the following illustration of how blessing may follow the preaching of God's word long after its spokesman has departed this life. The excellent John Flavel was minister of Dartmouth in England. One day he preached from these words, "If any man love not the Lord Jesus Christ, let him be anathema, Maranatha." Anathema in this context meaning accursed. The discourse was unusually solemn, particularly the explanation of the curse. At the conclusion, when Mr. Flavel rose to pronounce the blessing, he paused and said, "How shall I bless this whole assembly when every person in it who loves not the Lord Jesus is anathema, Maranatha?" The solemnity of this address deeply affected the audience. In the congregation was a lad named Luke Short, about 15 years old, a native of Dartmouth. Shortly after, he went to sea and sailed to America, where he passed the rest of his life. His life was lengthened far beyond the usual term. When 100 years old, he was able to work on his farm, and his mind was not at all impaired. He had lived all this time in carelessness and sin. He was a sinner 100 years old and ready to die accursed. One day, as he sat in his field, he busied himself in reflecting on his past life. He thought of the days of his youth. His memory fixed on Mr. Flavel's sermon, a considerable part of which he remembered. The earnestness of the minister, the truths spoken, the effect on the people, all came fresh to his mind. He felt that he had not loved the Lord Jesus. He feared the dreadful anathema. He was deeply convinced of sin, was brought to the blood of sprinkling. He lived to his 116th year, giving every evidence of being born again. On this fragment of history, the only fitting comment is Flavel's own. Though ministers die, yet their words live. Their words take hold of men when they are in the dust. Zechariah 1:6. We cannot doubt that the present reprint of Flavel's works will give yet further evidence of this same truth. Let's turn now to Flavel himself and to notes of a sermon that he delivered to an assembly of ministers on the occasion of the restoration of their liberty to preach, following the nation's deliverance from popery in 1688. Entitled "The Character of a Complete Evangelical Pastor, Drawn by Christ," and featured in issue 8 of the magazine, August 1957, we will read the first section. Who then is a faithful and wise servant, whom the Lord hath made ruler over his household, to give them meat in due season? Blessed is that servant, whom his Lord, when he cometh, shall find so doing. Verily, I say unto you, that he shall make him ruler over all his goods. Matthew 24, 45-47. We are met this day to review and consider the cases of our respective congregations, which I doubt we shall find too like that description, Proverbs 24:31, all overgrown with thorns and nettles, and the stone wall broken down. Thus, ignorance and error have overspread the people, and the wall of discipline greatly decayed. Our business is to cleanse our churches and repair their walls, that so they may become gardens of delight and beds of spices for Christ to walk and take pleasure in. Not to spend much time about the order and relation of the text, Christ had been solemnly warning the disciples and all the Christian world of his most certain coming to judgment, and therefore to beware of luxury, idleness, and security, the sins of the world, and that all be found at his coming watchful and diligent in their proper places of duty. This exhortation he infers from what common prudence would teach any servant, especially any steward of a house, to do, to whom his Lord hath committed the care of his family. It is agreed by all that the words have a special and immediate respect to gospel ministers, the stewards of Christ's house or church, to whom Christ hath trusted the care and dispensation of the affairs thereof. So speaks the Apostle, 1 Corinthians 4:1. Let a man account of us as the ministers of Christ and stewards of the mysteries of God. To them he hath committed the dispensation of the word and sacraments. Every private person who hath received any talent from God is a steward, and will be called to account for the employment or non-employment of that talent in the audit day. But ministers are stewards in the strict and special sense. Christ distinguishes them from the others, as porters from the rest of the servants. Mark 13:34. Nor may any assume that office but by order from Christ, the master of the family. In these words we find 1, an evangelical pastor described, 2, the reward of such as answer that description propounded. Blessed is that servant. 1. Christ's description of an evangelical pastor, verse 45, which he doth by 2 excellent and essential properties, or qualifications, faithful and wise, both which make up the character of a complete gospel minister. For if he be faithful, he deceives not others, and if wise or prudent, he is not apt to be deceived himself. His prudence will enable him to discern, and his faithfulness oblige him to distribute wholesome food to his flock. These two, therefore, meeting together, make a pastor after God's own heart, according to Jeremiah 3:15. Faithfulness is an essential requisite to a steward, 1 Corinthians 4:2. What ground is there for trust where there is no truth? Hence is that solemn charge, 2 Timothy 2:2, to commit that great trust of the ministry to faithful men. This faithfulness, as it respects God, ourselves, and the flocks committed to us, includes 1. Pure and spiritual aims and intentions for God. A servant must aim at his master's honor and interest, not his own. Fidelity will not endure self-ends, disguised with a pretense of zeal for Christ. Pure ends in our service will give abundant comfort at the end of our service. Have a care, brethren, of all designs to accommodate carnal interests under a show of devotion to God. 2. Personal sincerity. It is said of Abraham that God found his heart faithful. That is, sincere before him. Nehemiah 9:8. Let this be our rejoicing, that in all sincerity and godly simplicity we have had our conversation in this world. 2 Corinthians 1:12. We of all men are most in danger to be deceived by hypocrisy. For our employment lying in and about spiritual things, we are, on that account, styled spiritual men. Hosea 9:7. But it is plain, from that very place, that a man may be objectively a spiritual, and all the while subjectively a carnal man. Brethren, it is easier to declaim against 1,000 sins of others than to mortify one sin in ourselves. To be more industrious in our pulpits than in our closets. Believe it, sirs, all our reading, studying, and preaching is but trifling hypocrisy till the things read, studied, and preached be felt in some degree upon our own heart. 3. Diligence. A slothful cannot be a faithful servant. Matthew 25:26. His Lord answered and said unto him, Thou wicked and slothful servant, etc. The labors of the ministry are fitly compared to the toil of men in harvest, to the labors of a woman in travail, and to the agonies of soldiers in the extremity of a battle. We must watch when others sleep. And indeed, it is not so much the expense of our labors as the loss of them that kills us. It is not with us as with other laborers. They find their work as they leave it. So do not we. Sin and Satan unravel almost all we do. The impressions we make on our people's souls in one sermon vanish before the next. How many truths have we to study? How many wiles of Satan and mysteries of corruption to detect? How many cases of conscience to resolve? Yea, we must fight in defense of the truths we preach, as well as study them to paleness and preach them unto faintness. 4. Impartiality in all the administrations of Christ's house. He that is partial cannot be faithful. Oh, with what extraordinary solemnity doth Paul set on this exhortation upon Timothy. 1 Timothy 5:21. Brethren, you will shortly appear before an impartial God. See that ye be impartial stewards. Remember, all souls are rated at one value in your master's book, and your Redeemer paid as much for the one as for the other. Take the same care, manifest the same love, attend with the same diligence the poorest and weakest souls that are committed to your care, as you do the rich, the great, and honorable. 5. Steadfastness. Ministerial faithfulness includes constancy. Not a backsliding or flinching servant, Revelation 2:10. Be thou faithful. that is fixed and constant, to the death, and I will give thee a crown of life. Many of us have cause to bless the Lord, who enabled us to be steadfast and unmovable in the trials that have passed over us. But our warfare is not yet ended. Our faithfulness is not yet faithfulness to the death. We hope it will shortly be called so, whilst it thus involves our self-denial, sincerity, diligence, impartiality, and constancy. The second qualification in the text is ministerial prudence. The Lord's servant must not only be faithful, but prudent, discreet, and wise. Faithfulness will fix the eye upon the right end, but it is prudence that must direct to the proper means of attaining it. The use of prudence to a minister of Christ is unspeakably great. It not only gives clearness to the mind by freeing it from passions, enabling it thereby to apprehend what is best to be done, but enables it in its deliberations about the means to make choice of the season without precipitation by too much haste or hazard by too tedious delay. I know there is a carnal policy, an unworthy pusillanimity that often show themselves under the name of prudence. I have nothing to do with mock graces here. My business is to show you in what particulars true ministerial prudence is highly serviceable to the affairs of Christ's house or kingdom. 1. Prudence will direct us to lay a good foundation of knowledge in our people's souls by catechizing and instructing them in the principles of Christianity, without which we labor in vain. Except you have a knowing people, you are not like to have a gracious people. St. Paul's prudentials lay much in this, 1 Corinthians 3:10. As a wise master builder, I have laid the foundation. You can never pitch upon a better project to promote and secure the success of your labors than catechizing. What age of Christianity ever produced more lively and steadfast Christians than the first ages? And then the care of this duty most eminently flourished in the churches. We that live in this age have as much obligation as they, and God hath furnished to our hands the best help for it that ever any age since Christ enjoyed. Our venerable assembly, lately sitting at Westminster, now in glory, composed for us the most judicious and compendious system. And of course here he's talking about the Westminster Standards, the Confession of Faith, the larger and the shorter catechisms. 2. Prudence discovers itself in the choice of such subjects as the needs of our people's souls do most require and call for. A prudent minister will study the souls of his people more than the best human books in his library, and not choose what is easiest for him, but what is most necessary for them. Ministers that are acquainted with the state of their flocks, as they ought to be, will be seldom at a loss in the choice of the next subject. Their people's wants will choose their text, from time to time, for them. The greatest part of our congregations are poor, ignorant, and unregenerated people. This will direct us to the great doctrines of conviction, regeneration, and faith. Others are withering and decaying in their affections, or staggering and floating in their judgments. Prudence will enable the man of God to give to everyone his proper food, or physic, that is medicine, in due season. This will make us spend more hours in our studies, and set to it with all our might and skill, that thereby we may both save ourselves and them that hear us. 3. Ministerial prudence will show us of what great use our own affections are for moving of others, and therefore advise us that, as ever we expect the truths we preach shall operate upon the hearts of others, we first labour to work them in upon our own hearts. Such a preacher was St. Paul. He preached with tears accompanying his words. Philippians 3:18. A hot iron, though blunt, will pierce sooner than a cold one, though sharper. 4. Prudence will direct the servants of Christ, who highly value and earnestly long for the success of their labours, to be careful, by the strictness and gravity of their deportment, to maintain their esteem in the consciences of their people. In your pulpits, you are carrying on a treaty of peace betwixt God and them, and therefore it will not allow you to do anything out of your pulpits to make the breach wider, or hinder the happy close between him and them. Remember that of Solomon, Proverbs 11:30. He that winneth souls is wise. Prudence will not allow the ministers of Christ to intermix themselves with vain company, and take the same liberty they do in vain jests and idle stories. To you that are juniors and candidates for the ministry, I will assume the boldness to address you with one seasonable word of advice, and it is this: have a care of that light and airy spirit which so much obtains everywhere in this unserious age. It was the charge of God against some ministers of old that they were light persons. And yet I cannot but think, comparatively speaking, with some of our times they might pass for grave and serious. The people have eyes to see how we walk, as well as ears to hear what we say. It will be our wisdom and great advantage to be able to say, as St. Paul did, Philippians 4:9, the things which you have both heard and seen in me, do. 5. Ministerial prudence will send you often to your knees, to seek a blessing from God upon your studies and labours, as knowing all your ministerial success entirely depends thereupon. 1 Corinthians 3:7. Those are the best sermons that are obtained by prayer. Blessed Bradford studied upon his knees. Luther obtained more this way than by all his studies. If an honest husbandman could tell his neighbour that the reason why his corn prospered better than his was because he steeped the seed in prayer before he sowed it in the field, we may blush to think how much more precious seed we have sown dry and unsteeped in prayer, and by this neglect have frustrated our own expectations. Thus laying our foundations in the knowledge of principles, choosing our subjects by the people's necessities, working them first upon our own affections, enforcing them by strict conversation, by which he means a strict ministerial lifestyle, and steeping this holy seed in prayer, we shall approve ourselves the prudent ministers of Christ. Thank you for listening to the Banner of Truth magazine podcast. To subscribe to the magazine in print or digital formats, or both, see the show notes or visit banneroftruth.org.